The dense forest surrounding me felt like it had always been there, untouched and wild. It wasn't exactly a place most people would go, but that's exactly why I chose it. My name is Jordan, and I was 27 years old when I found myself heading to a cabin in the woods, far from the distractions of the city. I was looking for some peace, some solitude, away from the noise of my life. I didn't expect much except the usual fresh air, maybe some hiking, time to clear my mind. I wasn't prepared for the experience that would change my perspective on everything. I rented the cabin for a week, not too far from a small town called Wolf Creek. It was October, and the crisp air hinted at the coming winter. The trees had started to change, their leaves turning shades of red and gold, giving the forest a warm, inviting look. The cabin itself was small, nestled in a secluded part of the woods, far from the beaten path. It wasn't fancy, but it had everything I needed. A wood stove, a couple of bedrooms, a kitchen with old appliances, and a porch that faced the thick forest. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun barely hanging above the horizon. The drive had been long, the road winding and rough in places, but I didn't mind. It felt good to be alone out here, far from anyone who could bother me. I unloaded my car and settled in, lighting a fire in the stove to take off the chill. The cabin smelled like old wood, and the crackling fire added a sense of warmth to the otherwise empty space. That first night, I sat on the couch, reading a book by the fire. The silence was deafening in its stillness, but I found it oddly comforting. The only sound was the occasional pop from the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. Every now and then, I heard the distant rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig, but I attributed it to the animals in the forest. The place felt safe, peaceful, almost idyllic. I had no real plans for the next day, so I spent the morning walking around the cabin, exploring the immediate area. The forest was dense, the trees towering over me, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and the air smelled of earth and pine. I wasn't a seasoned hiker, but I had always enjoyed the outdoors, and this place seemed to call for a walk. I followed a narrow trail that veered away from the cabin, curiosity getting the best of me. It didn't take long before the path seemed to disappear into the woods, swallowed by the thick underbrush. I pushed on, not really concerned about getting lost. I had a map, and the cabin wasn't that far from the town if I needed help. The trail twisted, then opened up to a small clearing, where an old, weathered cabin stood, almost hidden from view. It was strange, this second cabin. It looked abandoned, the roof sagging in places, the windows boarded up. I approached cautiously, feeling a mix of curiosity and unease. The door was ajar, hanging crooked on its hinges. Inside, it was just as I expected, dusty, dark, and falling apart. The floor was covered in leaves, and the walls were lined with old furniture, half-rotted and covered in mildew. I didn't know why I went inside. It wasn't like me to explore old, abandoned buildings, but something about it drew me in. As I walked through the dusty rooms, I noticed something strange. There was a strong, lingering smell of mildew, yes, but also something else, something faint and metallic. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but the longer I stayed in the cabin, the more it became obvious. It was the smell of blood, old and dried. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt a chill run down my spine. I quickly left the cabin, not wanting to stick around any longer than necessary. As I walked back to the main trail, I tried to brush off the feeling of unease, but it lingered. What had happened in that cabin? Why was it left behind so out of place in the middle of the woods? That night, I tried to distract myself with a book, but I couldn't shake the thought of the old cabin. I kept imagining the strange smell, the sense of decay that hung in the air. It didn't help that the wind picked up, howling through the trees, making the cabin creak and groan. I kept hearing noises outside, branches snapping, the occasional rustle of leaves, but it was probably just animals. After all, I wasn't in a heavily populated area. I fell into a restless sleep, only to be woken by the sound of something heavy moving across the floor. My eyes snapped open, and my breath caught in my throat. The sound was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was in the cabin with me. I lay perfectly still, listening, my heart racing in my chest. The noise stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing. I strained to hear anything, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, dragging across the wooden floor. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had to do something. I had to get out of there, but my body refused to move. I couldn't tear my eyes from the door, expecting it to burst open at any moment. The footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom. My blood ran cold. Couldn't breathe. I wasn't sure how long I lay there, paralyzed by fear, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, the noise stopped, and I heard nothing. I waited, counting the seconds in my head. Was it safe to move? I slowly sat up, straining my ears. Still nothing. I quietly crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. The forest was still. No movement, no sounds. I could barely make out the outline of the trees in the moonlight, but there was nothing out there. I didn't know what to think. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it just an animal? Or had someone come out here to this desolate place for some reason I couldn't understand? I quickly decided I wasn't staying another night. The feeling in my gut, the sense that something was wrong, wouldn't go away. I gathered my things, packed up my car, and left the cabin as quickly as I could. The drive back to town was a blur. I barely noticed the winding roads or the quiet beauty of the forest. All I could think about was what had happened at that cabin, and the feeling that I wasn't alone. I never returned to that cabin. I don't know what happened there or why I felt so unsettled, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to stick around long enough to find out. It wasn't worth the risk. I never did find out the full story behind that cabin, but I heard rumors later when I returned to town. Apparently, it had been abandoned for years, but no one talked much about it. Some said it was once a hunting lodge. Others claimed it had been used by people who weren't supposed to be out there in the first place. Whatever it was, I didn't need to know. I didn't want to know. In the end, the woods are full of secrets. Secrets that are better left untouched. I learned that the hard way, and I'll never make the mistake of staying in a secluded place like that again. I'm just glad I made it out. The forest surrounding the cabin was thick, silent, and unforgiving. I'd never been a fan of isolated places, but when my friend offered me the chance to get away from the stress of city life, I couldn't say no. His cabin, tucked away somewhere in the woods, was supposed to be the perfect place to unwind, far from everything, surrounded by nature. I'd known John for years. He was the outdoorsy type, always hiking, camping, and finding new places to explore. So when he told me he had this cabin, I thought it'd be the perfect weekend retreat. I packed a small bag, grabbed some food, and set off. It was only supposed to be 2 nights. I wasn't nervous about the trip at first. The drive out was peaceful enough. The long stretches of empty highway and the slow winding roads through the forest didn't feel threatening. They felt serene. But the deeper I got into the woods, the quieter it became. The trees were dense and overgrown, blocking out most of the sunlight. It felt as though I was being swallowed by the forest itself, every turn a little darker than the last. The last mile was the worst. The road turned into a gravel path, full of deep potholes and sharp curves. My car was a little too low to the ground for comfort, and I had to drive slowly, trying not to bottom out. As I made my way deeper into the woods, I began to notice something strange. The silence wasn't just the absence of noise, it felt unnatural. There were no birds chirping, no squirrels darting about. It was like the forest had gone completely still, holding its breath. I finally reached the cabin just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. It was exactly as John had described it, a small, weathered building nestled in a clearing. A wooden porch wrapped around the front, with an old rocking chair sitting on the edge. The whole place looked like it had been forgotten by time, its wood faded and cracked from years of exposure. I parked my car, grabbed my things, and walked up to the cabin. The door creaked as I opened it, and a musty smell hit me immediately. The interior was dark, with only the dim light of the fading day filtering through the dusty windows. A small kitchen area sat off to the left, with a table and a couple of chairs. The living room, such as it was, had a worn couch, a few mismatched chairs, and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in ages. The place was cozy in a way, but there was a heaviness to it, as if the air had been trapped inside for years. I brushed it off as part of the cabin's charm and set about getting settled. Night came quickly, the temperature dropped, and the wind picked up, whistling through the trees outside. The quietness of the forest seemed to grow louder, somehow, as the night went on. I set up my small bedroll on the couch, built a fire in the fireplace, and tried to relax. But something felt off. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're alone in a place that isn't yours, like a nagging sense of unease that you can't shake. Around midnight, I heard something. It wasn't the wind. It was a soft, tapping sound, faint but persistent. I couldn't place it at first, but it was coming from outside. The sound echoed through the stillness of the night. Tap, tap, tap. I stood up, feeling a sudden jolt of anxiety. My first instinct was to ignore it, just go back to sleep, pretend it wasn't happening. But the noise wouldn't stop. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone tapping on the wood. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way to the door. I opened it just a crack, shining the light out into the yard. There was nothing. The moonlight spilled across the ground, casting long shadows from the trees. It was quiet, eerily so. No sign of anything that might have made the noise. I closed the door and locked it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. I double-checked all the windows, making sure they were secure, then sat back down on the couch, trying to calm my racing heart. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something. But then the tapping started again. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight and went outside, determined to figure out what was causing the noise. I walked around the cabin, the beam of light cutting through the darkness, scanning the ground for any signs of movement. And that's when I saw it. At the base of the porch, right where the steps met the ground, there was a small pile of dirt and leaves. But something was off about it. It looked disturbed, as if something had been digging around there. I knelt down, my heart thumping in my chest, and brushed aside the leaves. Beneath the soil, there was something shiny, a piece of metal slightly rusted, sticking out of the ground. I pulled it out, and it turned out to be a small, old key. My first thought was that it must have been dropped by someone else who'd stayed here before, maybe even John himself. But as I looked at the key, a cold shiver ran down my spine. There was something strange about it. It looked out of place, old, but not in a way that matched the cabin. I stared at it for a moment, trying to make sense of it, but all I could hear was the wind whistling through the trees and the soft rustling of leaves. It was then that I noticed something else, movement. It was very faint, but just beyond the edge of the clearing. Something was there. A figure standing still, watching me. I froze, my blood running cold. For a split second, I wondered if I was just imagining things. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or perhaps my mind was playing tricks on me in the isolation. But no, there it was again, movement just beyond the trees. I turned and bolted back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I clutched the key. I couldn't explain why, but I knew I had to leave. I didn't care how late it was or how far I was from civilization. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my phone, but there was no service. Of course there wouldn't be, I thought bitterly. I couldn't even call for help if I wanted to. I decided to leave as quietly as possible, trying not to make any noise. But when I turned to grab my things, I heard it again, the sound of tapping. But this time it was coming from inside the cabin. I spun around, heart racing, and scanned the room. I couldn't see anything, but the tapping was getting louder. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The closet door was ajar. I don't know why, but I felt an overwhelming need to open it. Something told me that if I didn't, I'd regret it. I took a step forward, my hand trembling as I reached for the door. I opened it. There, sitting on the floor, was a small wooden box. It looked old, covered in dust. I hadn't noticed it before, and I certainly hadn't put it there. My stomach dropped. I knew something was wrong. I wasn't alone, and whatever had been out there in the woods watching me was much closer than I realized. It was the middle of November when I decided to take a break from everything. I needed a place to clear my head, get away from the noise of work in the city, and just breathe for a while. A small cabin in the mountains, far from the nearest town, seemed like the perfect place. My name's Jack, and I was 29 at the time. I had booked a week-long stay in a secluded cabin near the small town of Pine Ridge, nestled deep in the woods of Northern California. I'd been there once before, years ago, when I was still a teenager. Back then, it was just a weekend getaway with my family. Now it was just me, a much-needed retreat from the grind. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just peace and quiet, maybe a little solitude for reflection. The drive up there was long, winding, and surprisingly beautiful. As I made my way along the narrow, twisting roads, the landscape shifted from dense forests to tall, thin pines that looked like something out of a painting. The air felt cleaner up here, sharper, like you could take a full breath without it feeling heavy. It was almost refreshing after the suffocating feeling of city life. The cabin was just as I remembered it. Simple, old, but sturdy. It sat on the edge of a clearing, surrounded by trees that looked like they'd been standing for centuries. There was no electricity, no phone signal, no internet, nothing but the basics. A small wood stove, a couple of beds, a rusty old refrigerator, and a bathroom that was more functional than comfortable. Just what I needed to disconnect. I unloaded my things, unpacked my gear, and set about making the cabin livable. There was a stack of firewood next to the stove, and I got a fire going right away. The warmth from the flames felt good against the chill in the air. Outside, the wind had picked up, and I could hear the trees creaking in the distance. It was calming, almost peaceful. That first evening, I spent my time just relaxing. I read a book, had a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers, and listened to the wind howling outside. As the sun set, the world outside the cabin seemed to shrink down to just the forest, the fire, and me. There was nothing else. Felt good. But as the night wore on, something started to feel off. It was hard to pinpoint at first. It wasn't anything dramatic, just an odd sense that something was watching me. I'd hear the occasional rustle from the trees outside, but it was the kind of sound that could be explained away by the wind. The cabin creaked now and then, too, but it was an old building. That was normal. Still, every time the wind howled through the trees, I felt a chill run down my spine, like someone was standing just outside the window, watching me. I brushed it off as nerves. The silence in the cabin was just making me paranoid. It wasn't the first time I'd been alone in the woods, and I was sure it wouldn't be the last. The next morning, I woke up to a light dusting of snow outside the window. The cabin was cold, but not unbearable. I threw on a jacket, made some coffee, and went outside to check out the area. The forest was quiet, the snow covering everything like a blanket. I decided to take a short walk, nothing too far, just around the perimeter of the cabin. I hadn't walked more than a few hundred yards when I noticed something strange. Footprints, fresh ones, leading into the trees. They weren't animal tracks either, too large for any kind of wildlife around here. Human. The prints were spaced apart, as if someone had been walking at a steady pace, not running or hurrying, but walking deliberately. I felt my heart rate pick up. I wasn't exactly out here on my own in a remote cabin to deal with other people. There were no other cabins for miles, and the nearest neighbor was at least a few miles away. I followed the tracks for a while, keeping my distance. The snow was light, so the footprints weren't deep, but they were clear. They led off the trail and into the forest, toward a part of the woods I didn't recognize. My curiosity got the better of me, and I kept following them. But after about a quarter of a mile, I stopped. I was just outside a small clearing when I noticed something strange. Two large, dark shapes near a tree. I moved closer, trying to stay quiet. When I reached the clearing, I saw what they were. Two large logs lying side by side. But there was something about them that didn't sit right with me. They weren't just logs, they were too uniform, too deliberate. I stepped closer, And that's when I saw it. A trail of what looked like blood smeared across the snow. My stomach churned, and I immediately turned around. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't know what to make of it, but I knew I didn't want to be here anymore. I turned and made my way back to the cabin as quickly as I could, glancing over my shoulder every few steps, half expecting someone to be following me. I spent the rest of the day inside, keeping the fire going, trying to shake the unease. There was no way I could shake that feeling. The feeling that someone or something was out there, watching me. But I didn't want to jump to conclusions. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. I was isolated in the woods, after all. That night, the wind kicked up even more. The trees were groaning, and the snow outside was falling heavily now. The storm had picked up, and I was starting to wonder if I'd made the right decision by coming out here alone. Around midnight, I heard something outside, a soft thud, followed by what sounded like scraping. It was so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it, but it was enough to make my heart race. I didn't get up to check. I knew better than to go outside in the middle of a storm like this, especially if there was something or someone out there. But as the night dragged on, the sounds continued. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It was something else, scraping, tapping, moving around the cabin. I couldn't tell if it was just the storm or if there was something more to it. By the time morning came, I was exhausted. The storm had passed, but the strange noises hadn't stopped. They'd only grown worse. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. I packed my things quickly and grabbed my coat. As I stepped outside, I noticed that the footprints from the day before were still there, but now they had been disturbed. The prints were deeper, more pronounced, like someone had come through after the storm. And now there were more tracks, these ones coming toward the cabin. I didn't stick around to find out. I loaded up my truck and drove back down the mountain as fast as I could, the whole time feeling like someone was right behind me. I never went back to that cabin. I never figured out who or what had been out there in the woods. All I knew was that whatever it was far too close for comfort. But the worst part? I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me all along, even when I thought I was alone. Even now, whenever I think about it, I wonder if I was just imagining it. But deep down, I know something was out there, and I'm not sure I'll ever know exactly what it was. The cabin was nestled deep in the forest, far from any town or other houses, in a part of the country that felt forgotten. I had rented it online after a few hours of searching for a secluded spot to escape to. At 29, I'd been living a fast-paced life for too long. Constant work, constant noise. The idea of going to a remote place, alone, without interruptions, was exactly what I needed. It was the beginning of autumn, and the trees were just starting to turn, their leaves a mix of yellow, orange, and red. I imagined long walks through the woods, a good book, and quiet nights in front of a fire. The cabin was small, just a single room with a loft for sleeping, but it was perfect for what I wanted. Simple, quiet, and isolated. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, just as the sky was turning gray with the promise of rain. The driveway leading to the cabin was rough, a dirt road that hadn't been maintained in years. As I drove, I couldn't help but notice how the woods felt like they were closing in on me. The trees stood tall and thick on either side, their trunks old and weathered, as though they had seen more than I could imagine. When I finally reached the cabin, the first thing I noticed was how silent everything was. The kind of silence that presses in on you, where even your own footsteps seem too loud. I parked in front of the small porch and got out, breathing in the sharp, fresh air. The cabin itself looked like it hadn't been touched in a long time. The wood was worn, the shingles on the roof curling up at the edges. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped up to the door, the wind rustling the leaves around me. I was alone, and the stillness felt almost unnatural. Inside, the cabin was as expected. Rustic, with an old wood stove in the corner, a couch that looked like it had seen better days, and a small table by the window. The kitchen area was basic but functional, and the loft above had a simple bed with a patchwork quilt. The fireplace looked like it hadn't been used in a while, but I wasn't concerned. I wasn't there to worry about the cabin's condition. I was there to clear my mind, and that was exactly what I intended to do. I unpacked my things and started a fire in the stove. The sound of the crackling flames was comforting, and for a while, everything felt perfect. I spent the next few hours reading, occasionally glancing out the window at the shifting shadows in the trees. The rain had started to fall lightly, tapping against the roof, adding to the peaceful atmosphere. By nightfall, the wind had picked up, and the rain turned into a steady downpour. I sat by the fire, sipping a cup of tea, and let the hours slip by. There was something soothing about the isolation, the absence of any noise or distractions. But as the evening wore on, I began to feel an odd sense of unease. The silence in the cabin was too thick. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the walls were pressing in on me. I shrugged it off as paranoia. After all, it was just me in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but my thoughts and the sound of the storm outside. But as I sat there, I started hearing strange noises, soft creaks and groans, like the house was shifting. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind. But then I heard something that made me stop. It was a knock, a light tap, almost like someone had knocked on the door. I froze. The sound was so faint, I wasn't sure if I had heard it at all. Maybe it was just the wind, but something in me urged me to go check. I stood up slowly, walking to the door. The knock didn't come again, but my heart was pounding. I opened the door cautiously, peering out into the dark, wet forest. The rain was coming down hard, and the wind howled through the trees. But there was no one. I stepped out onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under my weight. The air was cold, and the forest around me seemed more alive than ever. Every shadow seemed deeper, every rustle in the trees more pronounced. I checked the area around the cabin, but there was nothing, just the rain and the dark. I closed the door behind me, locking it. I tried to shake the feeling off. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the wind had made a sound that sounded like a knock. There was no one out there, but the unease didn't go away. I spent the rest of the night by the fire, trying to focus on my book, but every little sound in the cabin made me jump. The wind outside was relentless, making the trees bend and creak. Every time I heard a thud or a rattle, I'd tense up, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. By the time I finally went to bed, I was exhausted, but my mind was racing. I lay in bed, staring at the wooden beams above me, listening to the wind howling outside. The cabin felt different now, less like a peaceful retreat and more like a prison. The air was thick, heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I woke up several times during the night, each time more aware of the darkness surrounding me. The wind continued to rattle the windows, and the trees outside groaned and moaned in the storm. I kept hearing the same noises, creaks, thuds, and rustling. The sounds seemed to come from inside the walls, like something was moving in the space between the beams. But every time I looked, there was nothing there. When the sun finally rose, I was already awake, my body stiff from lack of sleep. The storm had slowed to a light drizzle, and the cabin was eerily quiet again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to go for a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. I grabbed my jacket, stepped out into the damp morning, and made my way into the woods behind the cabin. The trees were thick, their leaves wet and slick with rain. The ground was muddy, and my boots made a soft squelching sound as I walked. I followed a small trail weaving through the trees. The forest felt different now, more oppressive, as if it were hiding something. Every rustle, every snap of a twig underfoot made my heart race. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be following me, but each time I turned, there was nothing. I walked for about an hour, just trying to calm my nerves. But then I saw something up ahead, a structure barely visible through the trees. At first, I thought it was just another part of the forest, but as I got closer, I realized it was a small shack, old and run down just like the cabin. Curious, I approached it. The door was hanging off its hinges, and the roof had caved in places. There were strange markings on the outside, faded and worn by time. The air around it felt heavier, like the forest was holding its breath. I stepped inside. The air was thick with decay. The smell of rot and old wood overwhelming. The floor was covered in dust and debris, and there were old tools scattered around. Axes, saws, and other equipment that hadn't been used in years. But it wasn't the tools that caught my eye. It was the old, rusted cage in the corner. I approached it slowly, my stomach sinking. The cage was small, too small for an animal to fit comfortably. It was covered in grime, and the bars were bent and broken in places. There was something about it that made my skin crawl, something unsettling about its presence. I backed away, my mind racing. What was this place? Who had built it? And why did it feel like it was meant to keep something or someone inside? I turned and ran, not bothering to look back, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was back at the cabin, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I slammed the door behind me, locking it again, as if that would keep whatever was out there away. I spent the rest of the day packing up, trying to ignore the growing panic in my chest. By the time the sun was setting, I had everything ready to leave. I didn't care that I hadn't gotten to enjoy the rest of my weekend. I just wanted to get out of there. As I drove away, the forest seemed to stretch on forever behind me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadow of the cabin looming in the distance. But there was nothing, just the road winding through the trees. I never went back to that cabin. Couldn't. Every time I think about it, the feeling of being watched creeps back into my mind. And the image of that cage, the sense that it was meant to keep something inside, haunts me. I don't know what I stumbled upon out there, but I'll never forget the unease that settled over me once I stepped into the woods. I don't know who built that shack or what its purpose was, but I have a feeling I was never meant to find it. And I'm sure as hell not going back to find out. I was always the type to crave solitude, to enjoy the quiet stillness of nature. So, when I found the old cabin listed for rent deep in the woods of Montana, I knew it was the perfect place for a retreat, a break from the chaos of daily life, from work emails and social obligations. I packed up a few essentials, threw them in my car, and drove the 4 hours into the heart of the wilderness. It was the first week of October, the crisp air carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. The leaves had just started to change, creating a blanket of color across the mountainside. I couldn't have asked for better timing. The cabin was remote, nestled in a valley, far from any town or signs of civilization. The owner had mentioned in the listing that it was self-sufficient. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just peace. It felt like the perfect escape, and I wasn't about to let something as small as a lack of amenities get in my way. When I arrived, the cabin looked exactly as advertised. A small, weathered building, probably from the early 1900s, with a single story and a sagging roof that had clearly seen better days. The wood was dark with age, and the windows were cloudy with dust. A small porch with an old rocking chair greeted me at the front, while a dirt path wound down to a creek behind the cabin. I unloaded my car, setting up my things in the dimly lit living room. The place had that distinct old smell, wood, dust, and a hint of something musty. There was a fireplace against one wall, a few mismatched chairs scattered about, and a small table in the center. The kitchen was quaint, with an old wood-burning stove, a rusty sink, and mismatched cabinets. Everything was a little outdated, but nothing felt out of place. Felt cozy. I spent the first evening by the fire, reading a book, listening to the crackling of the logs, and watching the flames dance in the hearth. The silence was unlike anything I had experienced in a long time. I felt like I could breathe here, truly breathe. The world outside seemed so far away, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could relax. But as the night wore on, I began to notice little things. Small creaks and groans from the structure. I assumed it was just the old wood settling, nothing unusual. The wind outside was picking up, rustling the trees and causing the cabin to shift in the breeze. I pulled a blanket over myself and settled in, ignoring the occasional noises. It was just the house. I was alone, and I had to remind myself that there was nothing here to be afraid of. That first night, I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was enough to drag me from my sleep. I lay there for a moment, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The wind, maybe, a branch scraping against the side of the cabin. But then I heard it again, a soft, scraping noise, like something or someone was gently dragging along the floor of the cabin. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of the sound. It wasn't the wind, I was sure of that. The sound was too deliberate, too close. Slowly, I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand and turned it on. I sat up, my eyes scanning the dim room, the light flickering slightly as I shone it toward the source of the noise. There was nothing, just the empty room, bathed in the dim light of the flashlight. I breathed a sigh of relief and tried to tell myself I was being paranoid. It was just my imagination. The wind again. Maybe the old house had just settled in an odd way. I lay back down, trying to calm my racing heart, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise, every creak of the floorboards or gust of wind, made me jump. I eventually drifted off into an uneasy sleep, but the sounds kept me restless throughout the night. The next morning, I tried to push the strange experience out of my mind. The sun was up, and the light streaming through the cabin's dusty windows made everything seem warm and inviting. I made myself a simple breakfast of eggs and toast, then went outside to explore. The air was fresh, the ground damp from last night's rain. I spent the day walking around the area, taking in the beauty of the surrounding forest. I found a small, peaceful stream nearby and spent some time sitting by it, listening to the water flow. That evening, the air grew cold again, and the clouds gathered overhead. I built another fire, hoping to ward off the chill. As the night wore on, the cabin seemed to grow colder, despite the warmth of the flames. I kept the fire burning brightly, hoping it would push the unease out of my mind. But the same strange noises returned. The creaking of the wood, the scraping sound, faint but unmistakable, like something dragging along the floor. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, determined to find the source of the sound. I moved slowly through the cabin, checking every corner, shining the light under the furniture, behind the doors, and into the dark corners. But again, there was nothing. I felt ridiculous. I had to be imagining things. There was no one else here, and nothing had changed since the day before. The cabin was old, sure, but it wasn't haunted. I knew that. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, just on the edge of my consciousness. The next few days passed in a strange blur. I continued to hear the noises every night, always the same, soft scraping, then the creaks and groans of the cabin settling. But it wasn't just the noises that bothered me. It was the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone here, that something was waiting in the shadows, watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I decided to explore the cabin further, hoping to find some clue that might explain what was going on. The owner had mentioned that it had been in his family for generations, but he hadn't said much more than that. I started by checking the attic, a small crawl space above the living room. The ladder creaked as I climbed up, and the musty smell of dust and old wood hit me immediately. There was nothing up there but boxes of old clothes, some faded furniture, and stacks of newspapers. But as I was about to leave, I noticed something strange. A small, wooden box sat tucked away in a corner, nearly hidden under a pile of old blankets. I pulled it out, dusting off the layers of grime. It was heavy for its size, and the wood was intricately carved, though I couldn't make out the designs. I opened it cautiously. Inside, there was a small, rusted knife, its blade dull and chipped, and beneath it, a bundle of yellowed papers. I took them out one by one, unfolding them carefully. The papers were old, far older than anything else in the cabin. They seemed to be notes or letters, but most of the writing was too faded to read. However, one line stood out, written in dark ink, asterisk, "I won't leave until I've had my revenge." Asterisk. Chills ran down my spine as I read those words. I closed the box quickly and stuffed it back in the corner. I felt sick to my stomach, as though I had uncovered something I wasn't supposed to know. That night, the noises were louder. The The scraping seemed to move closer, as though whatever it was circling the cabin, just outside my door. Couldn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, the flashlight beside me, my mind racing. I was alone, but the cabin didn't feel empty. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things, packed up as quickly as I could, and headed out the door. The wind howled, the trees swaying violently in the storm that had rolled in. But I didn't care. I just needed to get away from the cabin. The woods felt alive, like they were holding their breath, waiting for me to leave. I drove back down the long dirt road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. When I finally reached the main road, I breathed a sigh of relief. The noise of the storm faded behind me, and the feeling of being watched began to lift. I never went back to that cabin. Years later, I heard the place had burned down in a forest fire, and when I read about it in the news, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. I'll never forget the unease, the feeling of something lurking just beneath the surface of the ordinary. But in the end, I was free. The cabin's secrets were buried, and I had finally escaped. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. I had booked a cabin in the woods, about 2 hours north of Denver, Colorado. The place was tucked away in a small, barely known national forest that seemed to offer the perfect escape from the noise of the city. My name is Max, and I'm 29 years old. I was working a corporate job that never seemed to end. Everyone in my office was constantly stressed out, and I felt like I was suffocating in that pressure. So when I found the listing for this cabin, I jumped at the opportunity. The reviews were glowing, saying how peaceful and private it was. People spoke of stargazing, hiking, and days spent by the fire pit. It sounded perfect. I left my apartment on a Friday morning, excited to finally have some time for myself. The weather had been unusually warm for late September, and I hoped it would stay that way for the weekend. The drive was long, but I didn't mind. It gave me time to unwind. The landscape shifted from city sprawl to vast fields, and then, as I got closer, the dense forest began to emerge, towering trees lining the winding road. Eventually, I reached the turnoff. A small, worn sign indicated the path to the cabin. I followed the dirt road up into the mountains, the ruts and bumps in the ground shaking my car with every turn. The cabin came into view after a few minutes. It was small, rustic, and exactly what I had been hoping for. It had a wooden exterior with large windows that looked out into the forest. The porch was equipped with a rocking chair and a couple of old lanterns. I parked in the gravel driveway, grabbed my bags, and made my way to the front door. The door creaked as I opened it. Inside, it was cozy, almost too cozy. It smelled faintly of pine wood and something else, maybe old leather. The furniture was simple, with a fireplace on one side of the living room, a couple of armchairs, a small wooden table, and a few shelves filled with old books. It was the kind of place that didn't scream luxury but whispered comfort. There was a loft upstairs, which I assumed held a bed, and a bathroom tucked away behind a narrow door. I spent the first couple of hours unpacking and getting acquainted with the cabin. The sky had started to turn gray, and clouds rolled in quickly. It wasn't long before the weather changed. The wind picked up, making the trees sway, and the sound of branches scraping against each other echoed in the distance. I decided to light a fire to warm up the place. The dry wood burned quickly, crackling loudly, adding a welcome noise to the otherwise silent cabin. As the evening wore on, the temperature dropped, and the storm outside intensified. The wind howled through the trees, causing the cabin to groan and settle. It was getting darker, so I threw a couple of logs onto the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. I hadn't planned on doing much that night, maybe just read or listened to music. But the longer I sat there, the more restless I became. Something about the solitude was unsettling. I wasn't sure if it was the storm, the isolation, or just the fact that I wasn't used to being alone in such a remote place. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to nerves. But then, as I sat there, I heard something. It was faint, almost like a tapping sound coming from the back of the cabin. I paused, staring at the fire. The sound came again, a rhythmic knock, as though someone was tapping on the window. My heart rate picked up, and I stood up, walking toward the back door. I opened it cautiously, half expecting to see an animal or perhaps a branch knocking against the cabin. But there was nothing, just darkness. The storm had grown stronger, with rain now pouring down in sheets, and the wind howling louder. I stepped back inside and shut the door behind me, shaking my head. It had to be the wind, I reasoned. I made my way back to the living room, but something felt off. The house felt colder now. The warmth from the fire seemed to be slipping away, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch longer. I sat back down, trying to ignore the unease crawling up my spine. But then the knocking came again, louder this time, closer. My eyes darted to the window next to the fireplace. There was no mistaking it now. Someone or something was outside. My heart skipped a beat, and I got up to check. I was hesitant, but I walked toward the window and looked out through the rain-soaked glass. The visibility was poor, but I could make out shapes moving in the darkness. Not animals, not anything I could immediately identify. People? No, that didn't make sense. I was deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest neighbor. I stepped back from the window, feeling my pulse thudding in my ears. The tapping continued, persistent, like it was calling me. It was coming from the back door. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The rational part of me said to just ignore it and go to bed. But curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed a flashlight, took a deep breath, and walked toward the back door once again. The storm outside was raging now, and the wind howled like something alive. As I reached the door, I felt a cold draft. I hesitated for a moment, then reached out and twisted the knob. The door creaked open slowly. I shone the flashlight around, but the beam barely cut through the rain and darkness. Nothing was there. I felt a pang of relief, but it didn't last. Something felt wrong. I stood there for a while, listening, waiting for any sign of movement. Nothing. The silence was almost worse than the noise. Just the sound of the wind in the trees and the relentless rain. After a few minutes, I closed the door and locked it behind me. But as I did, I thought I saw something. A flash of movement near the edge of the trees, a figure standing just outside the reach of the flashlight's glow. It was gone as quickly as I saw it. I couldn't tell if it had been a person, a shadow, or just my imagination. I spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every creak of the floorboards or groan of the cabin. I kept the lights on and the fire burning, trying to keep myself occupied. But no matter how hard I tried, sleep wouldn't come. Eventually, I decided to turn in for the night. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and after what felt like hours of staring at the ceiling, I finally drifted off. I remember when I first saw the cabin. It was tucked away in the woods, far from any main road, with only a single winding trail leading to it. It had always been a dream of mine to get away from everything, to escape the noise and bustle of the world. I was 27 then, living in a cramped apartment in the city. It was November, just before winter really settled in. I had been planning this trip for weeks, a weekend away to clear my head and reconnect with myself. The thought of being alone, with no distractions, no one else around, was calming. The cabin had been a cheap rental I found online. I didn't do much research. The photos on the website showed it to be old, but cozy, with a big stone fireplace and a view that was supposedly breathtaking. It was perfect for what I wanted. A peaceful, isolated retreat where I could focus on nothing but my own thoughts. I arrived late on Friday evening, the sun already dipping behind the mountains. The air was cold, with a biting wind that made the trees creak as they swayed. The cabin itself looked exactly like in the pictures, but there was something off about it when I finally stood in front of it. The wood of the cabin was weathered, and the surrounding trees seemed unnaturally tall, almost suffocating. But I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, the whole point was to disconnect from the world, and I wasn't going to let a few odd details ruin that. The door creaked open as I pushed it, revealing a dimly lit interior. A dusty, aged scent filled the air, the kind of smell you get when something's been sitting and used for a long time. There was a single lamp on a side table by the door, which I flicked on, casting a faint yellow glow. The place had that typical old cabin feel: wooden floors, mismatched furniture, and a stone fireplace that dominated the main room. The living room had a large, worn-out couch, a few chairs, and a coffee table that looked like it had seen better days. There was a stack of firewood next to the hearth, and the chimney was still intact. On the far side of the room, a big window looked out over the woods. I could see the faint outlines of trees against the darkening sky. I put my bags down and walked around a bit, checking the place out. The kitchen was small but functional, with an old stove, a fridge that hummed loudly, and a table that seemed big enough for two. I went upstairs to the bedroom, which was equally simple. The bed was a queen-sized frame with an old quilt thrown over it, and the walls were adorned with faded pictures of landscapes. There was an antique-looking wardrobe against one wall and a small mirror above the dresser. I set my things down and decided to start a fire in the fireplace to warm the place up. The wood was dry, and the fire caught quickly. I sat back on the couch, watching the flames dance and listening to the crackling of the logs. The wind howled outside, but inside it was calm, peaceful, the perfect setting for the weekend I had planned. But as the night wore on, I began to feel uneasy. At first, it was subtle, just the feeling that I wasn't quite alone. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was watching me, but every time I turned around, the cabin was empty. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. But when the wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the walls groan, the unease grew stronger. I decided to go to bed early, hoping that a good night's sleep would calm my nerves. But as I lay there, under the thick quilt, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence in the cabin felt too heavy, too oppressive. It wasn't the quiet of solitude. It was the kind of silence that makes you think that if you listened closely enough, you might hear something you don't want to. I woke up several times during the night, each time feeling more and more unsettled. The wind outside was fierce, the trees whipping against the windows. But it wasn't just the storm that kept me awake. It was the strange noises, soft, distant sounds that seemed to come from somewhere inside the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. Old buildings make noises, after all. But as the hours dragged on, I started to question that logic. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache, my sleep disrupted by the restless night. I got up, made some coffee, and sat by the fire for a while, trying to shake off the lingering unease. I had planned to take a hike that day, to explore the surrounding woods, but the feeling that something wasn't right still lingered in the back of my mind. The stillness outside was almost suffocating, like the entire world had gone silent just for me. I decided to go for the hike anyway, hoping it would clear my mind. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, the cold air hitting my face and making me shiver. The trees around the cabin were tall, their trunks thick and twisted. The trail started just to the side of the cabin and wound its way deeper into the forest. The first part of the hike was peaceful enough. The trail was well marked, the ground firm beneath my boots. But as I went further, the woods seemed to close in around me. The trees were denser, and the trail became harder to follow. I had to keep my eyes on the ground to avoid tripping over roots and rocks. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my feet and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I wasn't sure how much time had passed when I suddenly felt it, the unmistakable sensation that I wasn't alone. My heart skipped a beat, and I stopped in my tracks. I listened, straining to hear any sound, but there was nothing. I turned around, expecting to see someone behind me, but the trail was empty. Shaking it off, I continued walking, but the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it only grew stronger, like someone or something was following me. I quickened my pace, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But as the minutes passed, the sense of dread began to take hold. When I turned another corner in the trail, I came to a small clearing. There, in the center of the clearing, was a small, dilapidated shed. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, its wood rotting and the door hanging off its hinges. It wasn't on any of the maps I had looked at before I came. I couldn't remember seeing it in any of the pictures or descriptions. But there it was, in the middle of the woods, like it had always been there. My curiosity got the better of me, and I walked toward it. As I got closer, I noticed something strange about the ground around the shed. The dirt seemed freshly disturbed, like something had been dragged across it. There was no other sign of life around, no footprints, no animal tracks, nothing. I reached the door of the shed and pushed it open. The inside was dark, the air thick with the smell of mold and decay. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight. I couldn't see much in the dim light, but I could make out the faint outline of old tools and broken furniture. But what caught my eye, what made my stomach drop, was the old, faded tarp in the corner. I approached it slowly, my hands trembling. When I pulled it back, I nearly gagged. Underneath the tarp was an old, rusted cage, its bars bent and broken. There was a faint stain on the floor beneath it, dried and darkened with time. But what really made my skin crawl was the feeling of something watching me, even stronger than before. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned and ran, not looking back, my breath coming in sharp gasps as I made my way back to the cabin. My mind raced, my thoughts scrambled. What the hell was that shed doing out there? Who had been there before me? When I got back to the cabin, I bolted the door behind me and sank down onto the couch, trying to catch my breath. The fire had gone out, and the cold seemed to seep in even more now. I didn't feel safe anymore. The peace I had come for had evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming sense of fear. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, unable to shake the image of the cage, the feeling that something was still out there. But by the evening, I had made up my mind. I would leave in the morning. I couldn't stay there, not with whatever was lingering in those woods, whatever was still following me. The next morning, I packed up my things as quickly as I could, the sun barely rising in the sky. I didn't even bother to look out the window as I left. I was too afraid to. As I drove down the long, winding road, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadow of the cabin behind me, looming in the distance. But there was nothing, just the road stretching out ahead. I never went back to that cabin. I couldn't forget the feeling of being watched, the cold dread that gripped me every time I thought about it. It wasn't until later, when I did some research, that I learned about the old shed in the woods. It had been used long ago, but for what purpose, no one knew. I still don't know what happened there, what I might have stumbled upon. But I do know one thing. I'm never going back to that cabin. Not ever. I had always wanted a break from the chaos of everyday life, and when the opportunity came up, I seized it without hesitation. My name is Ethan, I'm 32, and I've been working as a freelance graphic designer for the past few years. Most days, my routine consists of long hours staring at a computer screen, surrounded by the hum of city traffic and the constant ping of email notifications. I needed silence, nature, and solitude, things that the city had long ago stolen from me. So when I found the listing for a remote cabin, deep in the woods of northern Maine, I didn't think twice. The photos online promised a quiet, secluded spot. It looked perfect. The cabin itself was simple, nothing fancy, just a small wooden structure with a porch, surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. The nearest town was miles away, and the listing assured me that it was the perfect place to get away from it all. I booked the cabin for a weekend, thinking that 3 days would be enough to recharge. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just some time alone with nature, a few books to read, and the opportunity to unwind. The drive out there was longer than I expected. I left my apartment in Portland early in the morning, hoping to beat the traffic. The road slowly turned from paved to gravel as I ventured deeper into the woods, and the dense forest seemed to close in around me. The sun was bright that day, but there was an eerie stillness to the landscape. No birds singing, no rustling leaves, just the steady hum of my car engine and the occasional distant sound of an animal moving through the brush. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the cabin. It stood alone in the middle of a small clearing, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to press in on all sides. The cabin itself was old but well-maintained, with a wooden porch and a simple, rustic charm. There was no one else in sight, no other cabins nearby, just miles of untouched forest stretching out before me. I grabbed my bag and made my way to the front door. The key was in a small lockbox under the porch, just like the listing had said. I opened it, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The interior was exactly what I'd expected, cozy and simple. A small kitchen area with a wood-burning stove, a table for two, a couple of chairs, and a couch that looked like it had seen better days. There was a small fireplace in the corner and a large window that looked out into the forest. The cabin smelled faintly of wood and earth, a scent that was strangely comforting. The floor creaked under my feet as I moved around, settling in and unpacking my things. That evening, I built a fire in the fireplace and sat in one of the chairs, sipping a warm drink and watching the flames dance. Outside, the air grew colder, and the forest seemed to grow quieter. I was alone, and it felt good. For the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. But as the night deepened, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything specific, just a creeping sense of unease that I couldn't shake. The cabin, for all its charm, felt a little too isolated. The silence outside was unnerving, and the wind had picked up, making the trees sway in a way that seemed almost unnatural. I tried to brush it off as nothing, just the unfamiliarity of the place, I told myself. I had rented cabins before, and it was always a little strange at first, but I would get used to it. The next morning, I woke up to a thick fog rolling in from the forest. It was so dense that I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I couldn't hear any birds, and the usual sounds of the woods, rustling leaves, small animals scurrying, were completely absent. The quiet was almost oppressive. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin. There was a small stream nearby, and I followed it for a while just to stretch my legs. The forest was beautiful, but the deeper I went, the more uncomfortable I felt. The trees seemed to grow taller, thicker, and the shadows longer. It wasn't just the quiet. It was the way the forest seemed to close in on me, almost as if I were being watched. That evening, I went back to the cabin and made another fire. As I sat in front of it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was like there was a presence in the air, something just beyond the edge of my perception. I tried to push it out of my mind, focusing on the crackling fire, but every now and then, I would glance up at the window and catch a glimpse of movement in the trees. But when I looked again, nothing was there. It wasn't until the third day that things really started to take a turn. I woke up to find that the fog hadn't lifted. In fact, it seemed thicker than before, and the air felt heavier. I could barely see beyond the edge of the porch. I decided to take a walk anyway, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. But as I walked deeper into the forest, I began to feel a sense of foreboding that I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the eerie quiet. It was the way the trees seemed to lean toward me, their twisted branches reaching out like hands. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. It was a figure, just standing there, a little way off the trail. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but there was something wrong about it. The person was completely still, unmoving. Their face was obscured by the thick fog, but I could see enough to know that they were wearing dark, weathered clothes, like something out of an old photograph. I froze, heart pounding. My first instinct was to call out to them, but the words stuck in my throat. Something about this didn't feel right. And then, without any warning, the figure turned and walked into the trees, disappearing from sight. I stood there for a long time, unsure of what to do. I considered going after them, but the thought of stepping deeper into the fog made me hesitate. I decided to turn around and head back to the cabin. The rest of the day was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the image of the figure from my mind. That night, I locked the doors and windows, not because I thought anyone would break in, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. I stayed inside the cabin for the rest of my trip. The fog didn't lift, and every time I looked out the window, I saw nothing but the swirling white mist and the occasional silhouette of a tree. The woods felt more and more oppressive, and the sense of being watched never left me. I decided that I'd leave early the next morning. When I woke up, the fog was even thicker than before. It was almost suffocating, and the air felt colder. I packed my things quickly, eager to get out of there. As I walked to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The woods were silent, but there was something in the air, something that felt wrong. I started the car, ready to drive back to civilization, but before I could pull out of the clearing, I saw something in my rearview mirror. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. My heart raced. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to look, but I had to. Slowly, I turned my head. The figure was gone. I didn't waste any time. I slammed the car into gear and sped off, not looking back until I reached the main road. By the time I reached the nearest town, the fog had begun to lift, and the air felt lighter. The sense of dread that had been hanging over me for the past few days started to dissipate. The woods were behind me and I was safe. I didn't go back to that cabin. It wasn't just the figure I saw in the woods. It was the way the whole place had felt. The isolation, the silence, the sense that something was off. I had gone there to escape the noise of the world, but I came away with a lingering sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, or the figure that disappeared into the trees. I'm not sure what happened out there, but I don't think I'll ever want to find out. Some places aren't meant to be explored, and some things aren't meant to be seen. It was late October 2017 when I decided to take a short break from everything. I was 34 then, living in Columbus, Ohio, working as a freelance web developer. The job was all right. I could work from anywhere, and that flexibility made it easy to burn out without noticing it. I hadn't taken a vacation in over a year. I'd stopped answering friends' messages, let dishes pile up, and kept telling myself I was just a few good nights of sleep away from getting back on track. I wasn't. I didn't want anything fancy or expensive. I just wanted to be alone, somewhere quiet, where I didn't have to look at screens or hear city noise for a few days. So I rented a small off-grid cabin up in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, outside a tiny town called Wakefield. The cabin was about 10 miles from the nearest gas station and even farther from the main road. It was surrounded by forest and sat beside a shallow creek. The online listing said it had no Wi-Fi or cell reception, which sounded perfect. I booked it for 6 nights. I packed light, a few changes of clothes, a small cooler with food that would last, a flashlight, firewood, some books I hadn't read in years, and a sleeping bag. The cabin had a wood stove, a manual pump for water, and a propane stove for cooking. There was no bathroom, just an outhouse about 20 yards from the front door. I left early in the morning to avoid traffic and made it there a little after 3 p.m. The road to the cabin was just a narrow dirt trail, barely wide enough for my Honda Civic. Branches scraped the sides of the car, and there were long stretches where I couldn't see anything but trees. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a strange kind of relief, like I had crossed some invisible barrier between noise and peace. The cabin was smaller than I expected, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet, with a steep metal roof and a small porch out front. It had one room with a cot, a table, 2 chairs, a wood-burning stove in the corner, and shelves lined with old books, mostly about fishing, hunting, and local wildlife. There was a hatchet and a rusty old saw hung on nails near the door. Everything smelled like pine, smoke, and dust. It was perfect. That first day, I just settled in. I unloaded my gear, chopped some kindling, and lit a small fire in the stove. I walked down to the creek and sat on a mossy rock for a while, listening to the wind and birds. It felt like I had stepped into a place where time moved slower. When it got dark, I heated up a can of stew, read a few pages from one of the books on the shelf, then went to bed. The second day passed quietly. I explored the area around the cabin, walking deeper into the woods in every direction, just seeing where the trees led. I found a small hill to the east with a partial view of the forest and the tops of distant ridges. I sat up there for hours doing nothing. I didn't see another person or hear a single plane overhead. When I returned to the cabin, I made a fire and cooked some eggs on the stove. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. But the third day was when things started to feel off. That morning, I went out early to collect water from the creek. The grass was frosty and crunched under my boots. I noticed something strange right away. There were boot prints near the edge of the water, close to where I usually filled my jug. At first, I figured they were mine, maybe from the day before. But the pattern didn't match my own boots, and the tread looked deeper, wider. Someone else had been there. They went from the trees to the water and back again. No sign of them elsewhere. I stood there for a while, just staring at the prints, trying to make sense of them. The woods were public land, so technically anyone could hike out there. But the cabin was listed as private property. There weren't any other rentals nearby, and I hadn't seen another person or car since arriving. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a hunter passing through. I let it go. I went about my day, but I kept checking over my shoulder while walking in the woods. That night, I locked the door to the cabin, even though I hadn't done that the first 2 nights. I also brought the hatchet inside and left it leaning next to the cot. Around 2 a.m., I woke up cold. The fire in the stove had burned out. I sat up to get more wood and stopped. I thought I heard something outside. Twigs snapping, then nothing. The wind had died down completely. I stood there in the dark, listening. My eyes adjusted, and I could see a faint glow from the moon through the window. I didn't hear anything else, so I figured it was just an animal. I put a couple logs into the stove, got the fire going again, and went back to bed. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. I didn't see anything strange, but when I walked out to the outhouse, I noticed something on the side of the cabin. Scratches. Deep ones in the wood just above the window. For parallel marks, like something had dragged metal or stone across the wall. I hadn't seen them before. I reached up and ran my fingers over them. They felt fresh. That was the first time I thought about leaving early. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe the scratches had always been there, and I hadn't noticed. Maybe it was some old branch or animal. Maybe I was overreacting. I stayed, but I kept the hatchet close, and I started locking the cabin even during the day if I went walking. I also began marking a stick with the direction and number of my footprints each day, just to reassure myself I was the only one making them. I told myself I'd come this far to unplug and be alone, and I wasn't going to let a few weird feelings ruin it. On the 5th night, I woke up again around midnight. This time, it wasn't the cold that woke me. I was half dreaming when I heard it. Something moving slowly on the porch. Not loud, just the soft thump of weight shifting on old wood. I held my breath. My eyes were wide open, staring at the door. The stove was still burning, so there was a little light flickering across the walls. I didn't move. I waited. The sound stopped. Then I heard it again. Slow, measured steps across the porch, stopping every few seconds. I didn't hear any knocking or attempt to open the door, just movement, then nothing. I stayed awake for 2 more hours, heart pounding, holding the hatchet in both hands. But nothing else happened. When daylight finally came, I stepped outside. The porch looked the same, but near the edge, I saw a cigarette, but still slightly fresh, not weathered, not wet. I don't smoke. That was enough. I packed my things in under 20 minutes, not even bothering to eat. I got in my car, turned around as best I could on the narrow path, and drove out of there. Every time a branch scraped the car, I jumped. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone stepping onto the trail behind me. I didn't call the owner. I didn't ask for a refund. I didn't want to know who had been out there. Whoever it was hadn't tried to hurt me, not directly. But I knew that feeling. I wasn't wanted there. Someone had been watching, waiting, maybe even walking around while I slept. I'll never know how long they'd been out there or what they were planning. Maybe they just liked scaring people. Maybe they were just waiting for the right moment. When I got back home, I didn't tell anyone the full story. I just said the cabin was too remote, too quiet, and I came back early. But I changed after that. I started locking my doors more. I paid attention to who was around me in public. I stopped going on solo trips, no matter how burned out I felt. Years later, I looked up the listing out of curiosity. It was gone. No trace of it. Like it had never existed. I even tried using the Street View feature on maps to find the trail, but it just ended in trees. Maybe they took it down. Maybe they didn't want anyone else asking questions. I've never gone back, but I remember those boot prints by the water. I remember the scratches on the wall, the cigarette on the porch. I know what I heard, and I know that whoever was out there didn't want me to leave feeling comfortable. They wanted me to know I was never really alone. I got the message. I don't camp anymore. I never thought much about cabins or camping in general. The idea always seemed like a good way to get away from the chaos of city life, a break from the constant noise. But when my friend Mark invited me to a cabin in the middle of nowhere, I didn't think twice about saying yes. I was 25 at the time, eager for some quiet, and the plan sounded perfect. I didn't realize how wrong I was about that. The cabin was tucked away deep in the woods, somewhere in the outskirts of Vermont. We drove for hours, far beyond the reach of cell phone service. The sky was overcast when we arrived, the air thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. Mark had found the place through a website that offered secluded cabins for rent, and the pictures made it look rustic and peaceful. Exactly what we were looking for. No neighbors, no distractions, just peace and quiet. At least that's what I thought. The cabin itself was older, worn down by years of being left alone in the woods. It had that old, familiar smell, wood, dust, and something else that I couldn't place. Mark had rented it for the weekend, and though it wasn't luxurious by any means, it was perfect for our plans. The walls creaked with every gust of wind, and there was a fireplace that made everything feel cozier than it probably should have. I was already regretting agreeing to the trip the moment we stepped inside. There was something off about the place, an unsettling stillness that hung in the air like a heavy fog. The floors were covered with old wooden boards that creaked under our feet, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Mark, however, seemed thrilled, immediately starting a fire and unpacking the cooler of beer we brought. "Perfect, right?" Mark asked, standing by the fire, a grin on his face. "Yeah, it's fine," I replied, though I could already feel my nerves start to tickle at the edges. Something about it didn't sit right with me. That first night was quiet, too quiet. The wind outside howled through the trees, and the occasional rustling of branches made me uneasy. Mark and I drank, talked, and tried to enjoy ourselves, but I kept glancing around the room. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch unnaturally, and every creak in the wood made me tense up. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Around midnight, Mark passed out on the couch, and I was left wide awake, staring into the flickering fire. The crackling of the logs seemed so loud in the silence, and I found myself listening intently for any other sound. The wind picked up, pushing against the cabin as if trying to force its way inside. I wasn't scared, at least not yet, but my unease kept growing. I finally decided to head upstairs and get some sleep, figuring I would feel better in the morning. The stairs creaked loudly beneath my feet, and I winced with every step. The second floor had 2 small bedrooms, one with a single bed and the other with a double. I chose the smaller room, hoping it would be quieter. Laying there in the dark, I heard the wind outside and the occasional crackle of the fire downstairs. But then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, a soft scraping sound, like nails on wood. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound wasn't loud, but it was distinct. I held my breath, straining to hear it again, but it was gone. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the wind. But as I tried to fall asleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The room felt too still, too cold. The air was thick, and the silence around me was suffocating. I woke up early the next morning to the sound of Mark rummaging around downstairs. The unease from the night before lingered, but I pushed it aside. I figured it was just the isolation messing with my head. As I made my way down the stairs, I caught a glimpse of the dark woods through the window. The trees looked thick, suffocating, as if they were pressing in on the cabin. "You sleep okay?" Mark asked, flipping pancakes in the kitchen. His voice was cheerful, but there was something different about him. His movements were a little too quick, his eyes darting around the room as if he were expecting something. "Yeah, just weird dreams, I guess," I muttered, not wanting to admit how disturbed I was. I didn't want to sound paranoid. He didn't respond, just nodded as he set the pancakes on the table. I couldn't help but notice that his grin didn't reach his eyes. We spent most of the day outside, hiking around the area. The woods were beautiful, but there was something off about them. The trees were so dense that even in daylight, the sun barely touched the ground. The air felt colder as we walked further into the forest, the sounds of nature muted by the thick canopy overhead. I felt like we were being watched. That night, we decided to stay in. Mark suggested we keep the fire going longer, and we sat by it, drinking more and talking less. The air seemed heavier in the cabin now. The wind outside wasn't just a gust. It was a constant howl, pressing against the walls, as if trying to get inside. As the hours passed, I found myself staring at the shadows in the corners of the room, feeling like something was just beyond my sight. I knew I had to be imagining it, but the longer I sat there, the more I felt like something was wrong. Around midnight, Mark stood up suddenly, walking over to the window. I thought he was just checking the storm outside, but then he froze, his eyes wide. "What is it?" I asked, but he didn't answer. He just stared out the window, and for a moment, I thought I saw his hands shaking. Mark turned away from the window slowly, his face pale. "I think we should leave," he said quietly. His voice was almost a whisper, and I could hear the tremor in it. "Leave? Why?" I asked, confused. "I don't know I don't feel right about this place," he said, walking toward the door. I watched him for a moment before standing up. The air was thick, charged, as if something was about to happen. My heart raced as I followed him out the door, both of us walking out onto the porch. The wind was fiercer now, howling through the trees, making it hard to hear anything else. The forest seemed alive, as if it were closing in around us. Every crack of a twig felt like a warning. "I heard something last night," Mark said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I think it came from the woods." I froze, my stomach dropping. I hadn't told him about the scraping sound I heard, but hearing him mention it made my blood run cold. Mark wasn't someone who scared easily, so for him to be this shaken made me realize that maybe I wasn't just imagining things. We decided to leave, and Mark quickly grabbed our things while I locked the cabin. The drive back felt like the longest of my life. The woods that had seemed so peaceful in the daylight now felt like a vast, dark sea, pressing against us, watching us. As we finally drove out of the forest, I glanced back at the cabin in the rearview mirror. The windows were dark, but there was something strange about it. The more I stared at it, the more I thought I saw something move in the shadows. I told myself it was nothing, just the dark playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew better. Something about that place wasn't right, and I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to forget the feeling of being watched. That was the last time I ever went back to that cabin. I never heard anything about it again. No news, no other stories. It was as if the place had never existed, a forgotten relic of the woods. But I knew, deep down, that something had been there, something that didn't want us to leave. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still waiting, deep in the heart of those woods. I always thought of myself as someone who liked a little solitude. A few days away from the noise of everyday life, a chance to escape and unwind. The cabin, nestled in a remote part of the Ozarks, seemed like the perfect place to do just that. I had rented it out for a week, a break from my usual routine. No internet, no distractions, just me, the woods, and the cabin. I had arrived late in the afternoon, after a long drive from the city. The sun had already started its descent, casting long shadows across the dirt road as I approached the cabin. The trees here were thick, their leaves nearly blocking out the last of the daylight. A sense of calm washed over me as I parked my car in front of the cabin. The cabin itself was older than I had expected, but in a charming way. Wooden, with a stone chimney, and surrounded by a modest porch that looked out onto the dense woods. I had chosen this place specifically because of its isolation. There was no one for miles, which was exactly what I wanted. Just quiet. I unloaded my bags and made my way inside. The air smelled of pine and wood, fresh and untouched by the modern world. The interior was simple, just a small living room with a few chairs, a fireplace, and a kitchen that looked well-worn but functional. A wooden staircase led up to the small loft, which served as the bedroom. It wasn't luxurious, but it was perfect. I couldn't wait to settle in. That night, I decided to keep things low-key. I made a simple dinner of canned soup and toast, something easy. I wasn't planning on doing anything too adventurous yet. After eating, I spent some time reading a book I had brought with me, and then I settled in front of the fire. The crackling of the wood in the fireplace and the occasional sound of the wind outside were the only noises. It felt peaceful, but there was something strange in the air. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I pushed the feeling aside. It was probably just the isolation getting to me. Before heading to bed, I took a moment to step outside. The night was cold, but clear, with the stars so bright it was almost overwhelming. There were no streetlights, no city noise, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. I stood on the porch for a while, breathing in the cool air, trying to shake off the nagging sense of unease that had begun to creep into my mind. I went to bed not long after. The bed was comfortable enough, and despite the odd feeling I couldn't shake, I drifted off quickly. The next morning, I woke up early. The sunlight filtered through the small window above the bed, and for a moment, I just lay there, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. Birds were chirping, and there was a distant rustling, possibly from some small animal in the underbrush. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore a bit. The cabin was surrounded by thick woods, but there was a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest. I grabbed my jacket and set off down the trail, hoping to get a good hike in before the day got too warm. The trees were tall, and the path was uneven, making the hike more challenging than I expected. But it was quiet, serene, and I found myself enjoying the solitude. About an hour into the hike, I came across something odd. It was a small clearing in the woods with an old stone well in the center. The well looked ancient, with vines creeping up its sides and moss growing thick around the edges. There was something about it that seemed out of place, like it didn't belong in the forest. I walked up to it, peering over the edge. The inside was dark, and I couldn't see the bottom. For some reason, I felt drawn to it, but at the same time, a feeling of discomfort washed over me. I stood there for a while, staring down into the blackness, before I finally turned away. I didn't want to linger too long. As I made my way back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The air had grown colder. The wind had picked up, and the trees seemed to be whispering, as if they were alive, shifting around me. The path I had just walked felt unfamiliar now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. But when I looked around, there was no one, just the trees, the underbrush, and the distant sound of the forest. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was high in the sky. I didn't know why, but I felt uneasy. I tried to push the feeling aside. I was just being paranoid. It wasn't like anything had happened to make me feel this way. I decided to sit down and relax for a while, but I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept wandering back to the well, and the strange sense of being watched that I couldn't shake. That night, I was on edge. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like something was wrong. It was as though the woods had become oppressive, the silence too heavy. The wind picked up again, louder this time, rattling the windows of the cabin. I kept hearing noises outside, scratching sounds, rustling, things moving in the dark. I convinced myself it was just animals, but deep down, I wasn't sure. The next morning, I woke up later than usual. The sense of unease had not gone away. It was as if the woods were pressing in on me, and I couldn't escape it. I decided to take a walk again, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but something was tugging at me, something I couldn't ignore. I made my way down the trail again, but this time, I wasn't alone. As I walked, I began to hear footsteps behind me. They were soft at first, but unmistakable. Someone or something was following me. My heart rate quickened, but when I turned around, there was no one there. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or some other creature. But the footsteps didn't match any animal I knew. They were too deliberate, too close. I quickened my pace, my steps growing faster, more urgent. But the footsteps behind me didn't stop. They followed me, never too close, but always there, just out of sight. I turned down a side path, hoping to lose whatever was following me. But when I looked behind me again, I saw something that made my stomach drop. At the edge of the clearing, there was a figure standing in the trees. I couldn't make out any details, but I could see the outline of someone just standing there, watching me. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just watched, and I could feel its eyes on me, heavy and unblinking. I didn't wait around to see what would happen next. I turned and ran back down the trail, back to the cabin, my breath coming in short gasps. When I finally reached the safety of the cabin, I locked the door behind me. The figure was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting. That evening, I sat in front of the fireplace, staring into the flames. The crackling wood was the only sound in the cabin, but my mind was racing. The figure I had seen, the footsteps, the well, it all felt wrong, like I had stumbled upon something I wasn't supposed to. I didn't want to stay another night, but I didn't want to leave either. I was torn, stuck in a place between wanting to run and wanting to understand what was going on. So I stayed, not knowing what would happen next. The following day, I decided to leave. Something had shifted in the air overnight, and I could feel it in my bones. I didn't know if it was the isolation, the strange occurrences, or just my own nerves, but I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things quickly, barely thinking, and drove out of the woods. As I passed the well, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, dark and endless, but the figure was gone. It took me a while to get home, but as I did, I couldn't shake the sense that I had narrowly avoided something. I didn't know if it was real or if I had just let my imagination run wild, but I felt like I had been warned. The woods, the well, the figure in the trees, something in that place wasn't right. When I got home, I tried to put it behind me. It was just a weird experience, something to laugh about, but deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. I had felt it, the presence, the eyes on me, the strange energy of the forest. And I knew I would never return to that cabin again. The woods had something hidden, something ancient and unsettling, and I wasn't meant to be part of it. It was over. The uneasy feeling I had carried with me had finally begun to fade. But I couldn't forget it, not completely, and I never wanted to go back to that place again. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. Just me and the cabin, far away from work, the noise, the people. The cabin had been my uncle's, tucked in the woods outside of Durango, Colorado. It was the perfect escape for anyone who wanted peace and solitude. He always said it was the best place to clear your mind. I didn't agree with him then, but I was willing to give it a shot. I'm 28, and until that weekend, I'd never really been alone in the woods. I grew up in a city, surrounded by constant noise, traffic, and people. Nature wasn't something I went out of my way to experience. I figured I'd try the cabin for a couple of days to disconnect, maybe hike a little, but nothing more. I didn't expect anything to happen. In fact, I didn't even know why I agreed to stay there by myself. Maybe I was just looking for a break from everything else in my life. The drive from Denver to Durango was long. By the time I arrived, the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains. The air had a crisp bite to it, different from the city, something more refreshing, something I didn't realize I missed. The cabin looked just like I remembered it. Small, wooden, with a rusted tin roof that still held up after years of weathering. It had a porch that wrapped around two sides, a few mismatched chairs, and a stack of firewood by the door. Inside, it was cozy, furniture a little old but still functional. The firewood was dry, the stove was clean, and the windows were covered with thin curtains that let in enough light to make the place feel warm. I made myself at home quickly, unpacking my bag and grabbing the snacks I brought with me. It was a lot of stuff for just a weekend, but I thought better to have too much than too little. I didn't plan on doing much that night. After the drive, all I really wanted was to rest. I set up the fire, grabbed a blanket, and sank into the old armchair. The only sound outside was the wind rustling the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling in the cold night. Around midnight, the silence was deafening. It was the kind of silence that makes you realize just how loud everything usually is. There were no streetlights, no neighbors talking, no cars passing by. The stillness was heavy, almost oppressive. I thought about going to bed, but the urge to explore a little kicked in. I figured I could take a short walk, just to get a better feel for the place. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The cold air hit me immediately. It wasn't unbearable, but it was sharp enough to remind me that I wasn't in the city anymore. I walked around the cabin first, scanning the tree line with the beam of my flashlight. The woods were dense, dark shadows swallowing any trace of light beyond a few feet. The trees were tall, the branches heavy with snow that hadn't quite melted yet. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I just needed to stretch my legs. As I walked past the side of the cabin, I noticed something odd. A large rock near the edge of the property. It wasn't in any way special, just a boulder, but it looked out of place, like it didn't belong there. The ground around it was soft, muddy, as if someone had recently stepped through it. I dismissed the thought, trying to ignore the weird feeling that bubbled up. The last thing I needed was to start imagining things. But something about the rock stuck with me. I shrugged it off and headed back inside, the cold starting to get to me. I closed the door behind me and made sure the lock was in place. The fire was dying down now, so I added more wood and settled back into my chair. It wasn't long before the silence began to feel strange again. I tried to focus on my book, but the crackling of the fire only seemed to amplify the quiet around me. I eventually gave up and went to bed, leaving the fire burning low. The bed in the cabin was simple but comfortable. I pulled the covers over me and closed my eyes. The first few hours were fine. The quiet was easy to drift off to. But then, I woke up in the middle of the night. It was a noise that woke me, a soft tapping sound against the window. It was faint, like the sound of something light brushing against glass. I lay still for a moment, straining to hear it again. Came again, barely audible at first, but unmistakable. The tapping continued in slow, deliberate intervals, almost like it was waiting for me to react. I forced myself to sit up in bed, the dim light from the fire casting strange shadows around the room. The window nearest my bed was covered with the curtain, but I knew I had to check. I stood up and walked across the room, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease in my stomach. The tapping didn't stop. I moved the curtain aside and pointed the flashlight toward the window, expecting to see some animal or perhaps a branch from a tree, something that could explain the noise. But there was nothing. The night outside was as still as it had been earlier. I let out a slow breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was the wind, or just my imagination getting the better of me. I stood there for a moment longer, watching the dark. When I turned away from the window, I felt it. A presence just behind me, like someone or something was standing in the doorway to the room. My heart raced. My skin prickled with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I whipped around, shining the flashlight into the doorway. Nothing. I don't know how long I stood there, flashlight in hand, just staring into the empty doorway. It wasn't normal. I knew it wasn't normal, but there was no sound, no movement. I didn't hear anything, and I didn't see anything. I forced myself to move, my mind racing, telling me to calm down. The rest of the night was a blur. I tossed and turned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept hearing the tapping, but it never seemed to come from the same place. Sometimes it was at the window, other times it was on the walls, the ceiling, or even the door. I didn't know how much of it was real and how much was just me being paranoid. Morning came eventually, though. The light of dawn filtered through the curtains, and with it came a sense of relief. I was alive and it was just another day. But the feeling stayed with me. Something wasn't right. The night had been off, and I couldn't figure out why. I decided to check the cabin's surroundings more thoroughly. I needed to clear my head, maybe even convince myself that I was overreacting. So, I grabbed my coat and stepped outside again. This time, I noticed something new: the rock. The boulder that had looked out of place last night seemed even more odd in the daylight. But it wasn't just the rock. The ground around it was torn up, like something heavy had recently moved through. The muddy footprints led off into the trees. They were large, too large to be from any animal I knew of. I followed them for a while, my footsteps crunching softly on the frozen earth, until I reached the edge of a small clearing. There, in the center, was something even stranger. A tree that had been marked, the bark carved with something that almost looked like a symbol. But it wasn't a symbol I recognized. It was jagged, uneven, and deeply etched into the wood. It took me a few moments to pull myself together. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all, but I didn't want to panic. The last thing I needed was to start seeing things that weren't there. I turned around and walked back toward the cabin, my steps quicker now, a sense of urgency pushing me forward. I hadn't made it far when I heard something behind me, a crack, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps on the ground. I spun around, heart in my throat, but there was nothing. The clearing was empty, the woods as silent as they had been before. I don't know why I did it, but I went back into the cabin and packed up everything I could. I wasn't staying another night. I didn't care how beautiful the cabin was or how much I needed the break. I needed to leave. The woods felt wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Maybe it was the strange markings on the tree. Maybe it was the heavy footprints I had seen in the mud. I didn't know, and I didn't want to stick around to find out. I locked the door behind me and drove away. The sun was high in the sky, but I couldn't shake the cold feeling that lingered on my skin. Even now, as I write this, I can't help but wonder about what happened that night. The tapping, the strange marks on the tree, the footprints in the mud. I never went back to the cabin, and I never planned to. Maybe it's just my mind playing tricks on me. Or maybe there's something in those woods I wasn't meant to see. I'll never know.